just ask Eleanor to confirm, so it's okay. So thank you very much to all the people that are attending this webinar. A very short presentation, a couple of minutes, because for sure is a 1 hour webinar with some questions. So we let Professor Focardi to introduce the topics and to present all the elements. This is the first webinar of our Brilliant project, and is related to the upgrade of your skills, know and be ready for the future. And this is the Be Brilliant Academy webinars. The topics for today is digitalization and cybersecurity, and it's just 1 hour presentation. Just reduce on my screen this one. Okay, perfect. What is Brilliant is a European project, and is especially in this case a strategic partnership, cluster partnership for excellence. This project has 7 industrial clusters of lighting, furniture, and construction. You can see here the cluster that take part. So we're talking about SICAT, Luce and Veneto, that host today the webinar. Mien, cluster Lumiere, cluster of furniture manufacturers, cluster Friuli Venezia Giulia, and for sure ELCA, that is the European Lighting Cluster Alliance, that is our meta clusters, European meta clusters for lighting clusters. Now, something about Professor Focardi, that is a full professor at the University Ca' Foscari of Venice. He's really helped us in over European project, and is always on the topics of cybersecurity when we need some help about cybersecurity problems in lighting devices, but for sure devices in smart building. Today, the topic is a little larger because of digitalization and cybersecurity, and the digital transformation and the security of data and connected system in the IoT-enabled smart homes and buildings. Challenges for smart lighting, furniture, and building sectors that are the main topics for all the clusters that take part in this project. So about the webinar is roughly 1 hour with roughly 45 minutes. Is right, Riccardo? And we let to have 10-15 minutes of question and answer session, but we also maybe if you need some minutes more, I think Riccardo is available to stay with us a little more. We are for sure using all the COVID-related measures that we have to use in our website. So we have 1 meter. So I think we can let Riccardo to leave the mask. I think it's better for our webinar. It's more friendly, and I think we can start with the presentation. For sure, I thanks all the cluster manager of the other cluster that take part to this webinar, and for sure all the Italian guests that we hope to have online this moment that can attend this webinar. For sure, is it in English? Is it a European project? And for sure we have to use the most common language we can use at the European level, but is a technical English, so I think you can really understand all the main elements of the presentation. So have a good webinar, and I ask Riccardo to start the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation and for the introduction. Just starting the timer so that I'm fine with the slot. Okay, so yeah, so I'm Riccardo Focardi, University Ca' Foscari in Venice, and as Alberto said, I'm leading the security group in my university, and I'm going to talk about digitalization and cybersecurity in the particular setting of IoT. So I will start with a brief presentation of IoT and security issues in this setting. And then I will cover a few examples, and I will give you some, concept about attacks in this setting that might be of interest for your network. Okay, so as you probably all know, IoT is we can think of IoT as an expanding interconnection of smart devices that range from appliances to tiny sensors. So the kind of device that we face are quite different. And in a sense, it's like a wide array of gadgets that we use in everyday life and communicate a lot. Communication is really one of the important issues in IoT because, in fact, IoT introduces like a new form of communication between people and things, which is kind of normal in a sense. We are used to use devices. But what is new is that things communicate each other in a very tough way. So these IoT devices, these gadgets are always communicating each other. And if we think of like digital transformation in this setting, I mean, this is a very new thing. Like we have billions of industrial and personal objects that are interconnected and also communicate all the way to the cloud. And this is really new and really kind of scary in a sense because we are always connected all the way to the internet, to the cloud. Another thing that is really interesting with IoT is the cyber physical dimension. What do I mean with cyber physical? IoT devices, they deliver sensor information and act on the environment. So they are digital things that can measure the environment and modify it. In this sense, they are cyber physical. So let me go through very quickly through the main components of IoT devices. So as we said, they can measure quantities like physical, chemical, and biological entities. But they can also act on that. So they can interact with the environment to produce an effect on one of these parameters that they can measure, right? So they can modify the environment in some way. And this is called actuator. Then we all know that we are, thinking of IoT as a smart something, smart cities, smart homes, and so on and so forth. The smart component is typically embedded in a microcontroller. So there's a small computer that implements algorithms that make the IoT devices smart. And finally, we said that IoT is strongly connected, and we have a transceiver, which is typically wireless, and is based on different technologies. They might use standard Wi-Fi connections, but there are technologies that are specific for IoT, like ZigBee, or technologies that are typical for like proximity communication, like RFID. We know that with cards, for example. Okay, so IoT is kind of changing the way we think of IT networks. As if we look at this pyramid, it is related to the quantity of of devices at the different layers. So let's start from the bottom. From the bottom, we have what is called the edge, and this is where IoT lives in a sense. And it's like millions or billions of devices, a lot of devices that communicate, as we said. Then there's a new layer that was not here before IoT in a sense, which is called fog. The name fog comes from the fact that this layer is close to the bottom, like the fog, and is not close to the sky, like the cloud. Okay, the name comes from this metaphor. Oops, sorry, pressed too much. And the fog is, we can think of the fog like a distributed intelligence. It's a lot of devices that compute in a very distributed way, and they are close to the IoT layer because you need some, you need to be quick, to be real time, and you want to do some computation directly at the bottom, right? Then we have the core. The core is you can think of that as the standard internet, the standard interconnection of the internet. And at the top, we have the cloud, which, contrary to the fog and the edge, is really centralized with few devices which are very powerful. And this is where management and analysis and aggregation happens. Okay, whenever the fog sends data up to the cloud. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about IoT security. If we think of IoT security, we have to understand what are the ingredients, the important elements of security in IoT. So first example is a typical local network where you have a gateway, so some device that is connected to the internet, and IoT stuff like surveillance camera, bulbs, appliances, switches. These devices might be very different, right? Because you might think, for example, a bulb, you can think of it as a very, very basic microcontroller with no security features, maybe, while, I don't know, a camera is much more powerful typically, and you can think of it as something that can do cryptography, that has some security implemented inside. So they might be very diverse. We also know that sometimes IoT devices are kind of connected directly to the internet because you want to access them directly with an IP address. And as we will discuss, this can be quite dangerous in general, right? Then we said we want to go all the way to the cloud because the cloud is where applications run, where you have all your data aggregated and analyzed. But of course, you also want to control the IoT from mobile applications. So there's a lot of different actors with different security features that we need to consider when you talk about IT security. Then we have the attacker, of course, the malicious guys. The malicious guys can be on the internet, and I mean, this is obvious because the internet is not trusted by itself, is a global thing. But we might, in the IoT setting, it's interesting to consider also attackers that might be close to our local network. Why? Because we said that communication is wireless. So, you know, you can intercept things, you can maybe, as we will discuss, the IoT network is big and is public, and so the attacker might be also there. So the attacker could be, in principle, could be everywhere, but these are the two main things that I will discuss later. Okay, so IoT security, why IoT security is complex? I already said that one problem is the strong interconnection, right? So we have a lot of devices that interact and exchange big volume of data. And we also notice that processing happens at different levels. So we have a lot of different technologies that we need to go through to have the IoT system, the global system work, right? So these different technologies make it necessary to go through different protocols and that might adopt different security solutions. And this makes it hard to analyze the security of the whole thing. So if you think of the IoT system as a big system with a lot of interconnected technologies, you know, understanding the security policy of the big picture is quite hard because of these varieties of things that you face. And so IoT, because of the thing that we have discussed, exposes a huge attack surface to malicious guys. The attacks can be physical, can be, you know, the local network, can be remote, can be on the gateways, and can be kind of everywhere. Okay, so if you can think of this slide from a different perspective, whenever you have a system, if the system is complex with the varieties of technologies, the attack surface become big all the way. So IoT is very complex and very variegate. There's one more thing that makes IoT security really hard to achieve, which is usually referred to as patching vulnerability. Any system has vulnerabilities, like so embedded devices have vulnerabilities. The point with IoT is that usually, in most of the cases, there's no good way to patch this vulnerability. Patch means, you know, fixing them. So you want to keep the system up to date and secure. And this is patching. This is called patching in computer science. And the reason why there's no good way to patch them, well, there are, you know, many reasons, but here I'm trying to list what I believe are the main ones, the most important ones. The first is that IoT devices usually are cheap. And manufacturers, when they develop these devices, they need to select cheap hardware, okay? And this hardware might not support secure firmware upgrade or might not support firmware upgrade at all, okay? This is the first reason. The second one is that, you know, firmware is software. It's something that you have to maintain. If you have a bug, you have to fix it. And this is, of course, requires a team that maintains the firmware and develops the firmware. And this has a cost. So if you combine together the fact that the hardware is cheap and that keeping the firmware, and so fixing the bugs is expensive, the two things together make us, you know, understand why we have this patching vulnerability around in many IoT systems. I think I mean, if you in this period of the COVID lockdown, a lot of people, as you know, bought tablets because we need to work from home, and probably have noticed that there are a lot of tablets on the market that are really cheap, and these tablets are good. They have a good hardware inside, but the typical thing that they don't have is the firmware, the system upgrade is not really much supported, and this is why. I mean, this is the same reason as before. So developing and keeping software up to date as a cost. So these tablets, in order to be cheap, they have to cut a lot of things, and they cut also on upgrades and on security. Okay, so they are really fine, but after a year, they still have the same operating system. So the consequence of this patching vulnerability is that there are millions of vulnerable devices around. And this is one of the big problems with IoT that we have to face. We have to understand how to make this better and more secure. Okay, so one thing is, I mean, anytime you need to do some security in a particular setting, I mean, one thing that you typically try to do is to look for rules, recommendations, and guidelines. There are some around. I'm mentioning one here that is from this International Telecommunication Union standardization. And I will give you the link in the next slide. They published a list of security requirements for IoT. I'm not saying that this is the only possible standard, but it's interesting to have a look because, you know, they made an effort of trying to put down all the requirements that are important. So if you have a look, you will find interesting things for your systems. Very generally speaking, they cover these topics. They cover communication, data management, and service provision security. They cover the integration of security policies and techniques, which is what, as I mentioned before, if you have different technologies in the same system, you have to integrate them. And if you think of security, policies might become different at different layers. So you need a way to integrate them in a consistent way, okay? And then they cover authentication and authorization. There are two very important properties, security properties. So you want to identify securely and to authorize securely entities and users. And they also cover security audit, which is more about, you know, tracing what's going on. You want to keep trace of what happens in your system so that you can check it and find where problems be or have been in the past. I'll go a little bit more into detail, not too much, just to give you more practical examples of these recommendations. So for example, they, for what concerns communication, data management, and service provision, they mention that they need to be secure, trusted, and privacy protected. So secure means that you want, for example, you want communication to be secure to cryptographic protocols. You don't want anyone to intercept what you are communicating or to modify what you are communicating. You want to trust what you communicate with. So you want strong authentication things, mechanisms. but you also want to protect the privacy, which is a bit different from security. I will cover it in a specific slide later. So security, trust, and privacy. Integration, we said already that security policy should be integrated in a consistent way among different IoT networks and users. One thing that is sometimes is hard to integrate is, the digital identity of users. So you have a user that logs in a way at the cloud level, for example, and logs in a different way on IoT devices. You'd like to have this thing integrated in a way that the user has to log once, and is the identity is kind of recognized at all the layers. So you need to integrate this authentication part. Again, about authentication, they talk about mutual authentication for both devices and users to the IoT system. So mutual authentication is important. Mutual means that you authenticate both sides, right? So for example, for devices and IoT, you want the device to be identified before it gets into the IoT system. You don't want devices that you don't recognize to join, but you also want the device to check that the IoT network or system it is joining is the correct one. You don't want the device to join something which might be malicious. And the same holds for users. So users should authenticate to the system, but they also want to be sure that they are communicating with the correct system, and that there's no someone in the middle that might cheat them. Okay, so mutual authentication, this is very important. And finally, as I said, for security audit, you'd like that transmission, storage, processing, and access should be traceable, because you want to be able to, maybe if there's an incident, a security incident, you want to be able to check the logs and see what happened to your system, who might be responsible of what. Okay, and this is auditing and tracing. Okay. This is the link that you, but if you Google for that, you will find it. You find the full documents of these recommendations. Okay, let me go through a couple of examples. I'm taking two settings. One is the lighting system, the other one is surveillance. So for lighting, my personal view of the systems, maybe you have a different view because maybe you have more like an industrial view, and could be interesting to discuss about this. But from my academic point of view, there are interesting features about systems for lighting. First of all, as I said before, devices are typically quite constrained with limited security capabilities, because you have a lot of small devices like bulbs and switches, and I wouldn't expect that these devices have huge computation power. It's very dynamic. You want to be able to modify a lighting system in a quite flexible way. You have to replace devices. I guess that bulb lifetime is not so big, so you want to be able to replace devices quite frequently. Probably you don't have so much sensitive data. I mean, in typical system, I don't think they collect or store sensitive data, but there might be privacy issues. So for sure, you want to the surfaces, the availability of the service to be secured, because if your lighting system goes down, you might have safety problems or, of course, economical problem. But for what concerns privacy, I'm thinking, for example, of a system that is smart and react to the position of people in a room. And of course, in order to do that, there's some sensor that collects your movements, your habits, and this goes into the privacy world. So as soon as you have data about people, you have privacy issues, and so you need to deal with that. Maybe you can deal with that at the fog level, as we said. You don't want to send all of this data to the cloud, but if you do, of course, you have privacy concerns about it. And authentication of devices entering the network is important, and also authorization. So these things are kind of complementary to the setting in a sense. So let's go through a different example, which is surveillance systems like with camera and stuff like that. I think it's quite different because I can think of camera as much powerful devices that potentially have good security capabilities because they need to deal with images, so they need some good processor to do that. And well, we know that these much more powerful devices are potential targets for what is called distributed denial of service, DDoS. I cannot find the pointer. Okay, DDoS, which is distributed denial of service. So what is a DDoS? Is when, and a botnet. A botnet is when an attacker gets into a system and makes the system part of a malicious network, right? So like by putting some malicious firmware on it. So the system, the device becomes part of a network without knowing. So it's still going, still working as before, but it's also under the control of the attacker. So the attacker can control the device and the resources of the device, like the CPU. At that point, the attacker can have like thousands of these devices under the control, and this is called a botnet. And from this botnet, the attacker can launch attacks on, I don't know, on a nation or a company from many different IPs. And this is very hard to stop, right? Because if you get packets from a lot of different places, you can try to blacklist these IPs, but if they are like thousands or millions, that's become impossible. And we have these nation level attacks or big company attacks that can put down a system very, very easily. So this is different from the lighting system where I cannot, I wouldn't expect like a botnet of bulbs, okay, because they are not so powerful. But a botnet of camera, maybe yes, and it has been done. They are more static. Probably you don't want to replace the devices so frequently. The fact it is static and you have no replacement makes it, in a sense, allows you to use more secure protocols for joining the network. I will talk about that later. You have sensitive data in this case because they have the images of people. As before, you want service provision and availability to be strong, and also privacy. And authentication and authorization, as I said, they are kind of complementary. You always want them in a sense. But you see there are big differences. So the two examples are to show you that depending on the setting, you might have different requirements and different risks that you want to manage, okay? Good, so about risk, this is a very important aspect of security. So security is not only about putting in place state-of-the-art mechanisms. You need to do that in a way that is cost-effective. And this is what risk assessment is about. Because ideally, you would like to completely remove the risk of a cyber attack. This is what everybody would like to do. But this is not possible because you can only reduce it, right? So the big question that you need to ask yourself is what is an acceptable level of risk for your system? And this is what risk assessment does, right? The idea is quite simple. It comes from economy in a sense. So you have the cost of resources to reduce the risk, and this is proportional to the cost to your organization if the risk occurs, right? Is what insurance do, right? So you have a risk, you have a cost if that happens, and you need to invest resources to reduce the risk. And the cost, of course, should be proportional. But it's not just about that. When you evaluate the risk, you also have to consider the likelihood. So if something is really expensive when it happens, but is really unlikely, maybe you can tolerate it. If something is really cheap, but is very, very likely, well, I don't know, maybe if it is cheap, it's worth fixing it because it's very likely, right? So it's not that if the risk is big, you have to fix it all the way, because maybe it's really, really unlikely to happen. I'm taking, again, the example of the distributed denial of service. Probably lighting devices are not good targets for that. So maybe that's not a risk. The risk is big because if you should become part of a botnet, is really, really bad. You might also have legal issues because there's an attack starting from your devices, right? But probably in that setting, the likelihood is very low. So maybe you don't want to fix this as a high priority. Maybe you have different things to think of, right? It's a matter of priorities. The second thing that you have to consider is, apart from the cost, is what properties you want to cover, right? Because in order to assess the risk, you first need to know what you want to have. Once you know what you want to have, you can assess the risk of an attack. And just to give you very kind of standard examples of properties, confidentiality is about protecting sensitive data that you collect or send or transmit. Privacy, as we said, is relevant if you, for example, if you track people, okay? Integrity is very important. For example, we mentioned the fact that a device might become part of the botnet, and this happens because the attacker gets into the device and replaces the firmware with something which he or she can control. So this is about the integrity of your system, of your firmware, of your configuration that should be protected. Availability means that the system should be up and running. Typically, if you don't have availability, you might have safety or economic consequences. So, for example, for lighting, but also different things like security consequences for surveillance. Of course, if someone is able to shut down all your camera, you have security issues because you are physically, protecting the security of something. And one particular thing that I mentioned, because it's really important in the IoT setting, is what I call IP protection. So if you have your protocols, your algorithms, so what we call the smart component in your firmware, in your device, so it is part of the device because it is part of the software, of the firmware that runs on the device. Of course, one problem that you might have is that someone gets his hands on the device and try to steal your IP, right? Your algorithms and protocols. Okay, and this is a particular thing of IoT, right? Because you have these devices replicated a lot all around, and you cannot physically protect them. They are just in the environment. Okay. As I promised, privacy, I had a slide on privacy. Privacy, well, we all know that privacy is debated a lot, especially nowadays with these apps that try to track the virus and stuff like that. But in general, privacy is becoming more and more critical. And the fact that IoT, as we said, is extremely connected at home, at work, in car shops, we even have wearable devices that are connected. This makes it possible to collect data about individuals, right? So governments, but also private enterprises can do that. They do that. Medical information, location, movement, and so on and so forth. And we know that people are more and more concerned about this. Every day we have these discussions in the news. This is why in the GDPR they imposed legal requirements on that. So of course, even if privacy is not the main issue in your IT system, you have to have a look at at the regulations, because you need to be compliant to that. But as I said, the quantity of privacy, the quality and the quantity of privacy that you need to have depends really a lot on the application and on the data that you manage. But of course, it's something that we need to understand and to deal with. Okay, let me go a little bit through just a little bit through technical issues, just to give you the idea of what do I mean by security and by attacks. So the first thing that I want to mention is that the gateway is this device that is in between the internet and your IoT network, is very, very important for security, especially when devices have limited security capabilities. Because the gateway usually is like a full computer that can do much more security than the devices, right? And so should provide at least authentication and secure communication with devices and applications, security and privacy of data, even when you store them, remote management, and firmware and software update. So I have a picture to illustrate these things. Okay, so the gateway is this thing in between a local network and the internet, or in between different local networks, right? So on one side, we have our IoT network, we have the internet, we have mobile apps and the cloud, right? And the gateway is here. So now the first thing that okay, let's focus on the fact that the attacker can be on the internet and on the local network, as we said before. So the third property that I mentioned is that the gateway should provide authentication and secure communication with the devices. So this is the side from the gateway to the devices. So you would like to have some secure identification or authentication on this side, and also secure communication. And this is, you want to have that because the attacker might be here, right? But of course, you also want to have secure authentication and secure communication on the other side. So from the mobile apps and to the cloud, bidirectional things, right? So now if you think of this, if you look at this picture, you can notice that the gateway might use quite different technologies on the two sides, right? So on the one side might use, like, I don't know, TLS or IPsec, standard protocols on the internet. On the other side, probably it will use security of the IoT technology, right? So in a sense, the gateway is kind of, translating the security on the two sides. But if you are able to have security on both sides, then you have security end to end from the cloud to the devices and vice versa. The other thing is, you want to have remote management, and this is done if you have this secure communication and authentication. You can do that because you have a secure and trusted channel to communicate with the IoT network. And you also want to have secure storage and firmware update capabilities. And so the gateway, for example, might be able to upgrade the firmware on the devices and also to download the firmware securely from the cloud, right? So using the two secure communication on the two sides might be able to do that. And also store securely data, let's say at the fog or edge layer, because the gateway is on that side, okay? So if you have sensitive data here that you don't need to send to the cloud, they might be stored here, but they need to be stored in a secure way. Okay, so what attacks you might expect on an IoT network? Okay, first thing is physical attack. And sorry about this, but we had to move the slides on a different computer. So this is supposed to be like the attacker logo. So think of something black and nasty, okay? It's not a cloud like that. Okay, so this is the attacker. The attacker might be able to steal one device from like one bulb from the network, and then offline analyze and dismantle the device, okay? This is called physical attack. So the assumption is that the attacker has physical access to the devices. Think of a public environment, like, I don't know, a big shopping center with a smart lighting system. The bulbs are all around, and the attacker is just able to steal one, okay? Then what you typically do in a physical attack, you reverse engineer the device. So you start dismantling it and try to extract the firmware. This breaks the IP. This can extract the credential and cryptographic keys to access the IoT network. So you might attack one device to attack more devices. And just to give you a practical example, if you know ZigBee, there are two security models in ZigBee. One is called the distributed model, and that model uses the same link key, cryptographic key for all the devices. So if you extract this cryptographic key from one device, you have the cryptographic key of all the devices in the same ZigBee network. And this is bad for security. What are the remedies that we can put in place? There's one which is really, really appealing, but it's also expensive. So it's not used, it is used, but it's not so kind of popular on all the IT devices. The solution is to use a secure element, which is a special chip that performs cryptography, protects credentials, can be used to check system integrity, to perform secure firmware upgrade, to protect IP, and so on and so forth. So it's like a special secure microcontroller that makes all the security inside. But this is, of course, expensive. If you don't have that in your hardware, a typical technique to try to protect the IP is obfuscated. This mitigates reverse engineering because it makes the firmware hard to understand in a sense. But one very important thing that you should always do is to adopt what is called baseline security. So baseline security is like security that you have, but maybe you don't use because you don't configure the system correctly. So just to give an example, ZigBee can be configured so to have different link keys for each device. And so you should do that. You should make the effort of switching to a ZigBee security model that is probably a little bit more complicated, but much more secure. And just to give you a more trivial example, if you don't configure ZigBee at all, there's a default key, which is this one, ZigBee Alliance 09, is exactly this password, which is like the default password in the home automation profile. So if you use home automation profile, all your devices are using this well-known password to authenticate to the network. So any attacker can actually get into your IT network. So don't change it if you're using it, okay? Another attack is the opposite. The fact that the attacker, which is again this cloud, has a malicious device, this orange bulb, and tries to put it, it's not working. All right, it is, sorry, it was just a bit late, a bit slow. Okay, put it in your network. So it's not taking out your honest device, but it's putting a malicious device inside, okay? Yeah, notice that this is one possibility. Another possibility is that the honest administrator, the blue guy here, installs a new device, a new bulb in the network, and it doesn't know that this bulb is a Trojan device. So a device that appears to be fine, but inside it has like some malicious firmware. Okay, this is also a possibility. So you buy some bulb from a manufacturer that you don't trust, and this bulb might contain firmware that is doing nasty things on your IoT network. This is another possibility. So a malicious guy putting a malicious device, a honest guy putting a malicious device without noticing, okay? This is called Trojan attack. So the first assumption is that the attacker has physical access to the network, not to the device. This is different, right? Because the network is wireless. The attacker might be like in proximity of the network without putting his hands on the device. So suppose you have a smart apartment with smart lighting and the attacker is just outside. Maybe the IoT network is also controlling the door. The attacker is just outside and is trying to connect to the wireless network without entering the apartment, okay? So also a private one in the range of the wireless network. Or the administrator is installing something which is malicious without noticing. These are the two possibilities. In both cases, you have a malicious IoT device in your system. This can tamper with your network and can be used as an entry point for injecting malicious commands, leaking data, breaking availability, and so on and so forth. It's like the attacker entry point for your network. To go back to my previous example, if you use this standard password ZigBee Alliance 09, for the attacker, it's really trivial to do that because you can just, join the IoT network by using the default password. So in that case, you don't have any security on pairing, okay? So what are the security mechanisms that you might adopt to mitigate or to prevent this? So pairing is crucial. Pairing is this phase where you pair your device with the IoT network. It's crucial because it exchanges the authentication credentials used by the device to register, right? There are secure pairing technologies around, and typically they are based on out-of-band information, like out-of-band IDs or labels or QR codes that you need to register in the controller node in order to enable new nodes. Why is this? Why do you need that? Because in order to join securely, you need the controller to securely know the identity or the credentials of the device that you are registering. So you need a way to register something in the controller node in order to add a new node. Otherwise, probably they share the same key if you just, plug and place things in your system. Another possibility is to use NFC RFID technology, so proximity technology. So you put your device close to a controller node, but very, very close. And after that, it is registered. So it is another way to exchange out-of-band information. It's more expensive because you need another transceiver, but it's very usable and interesting. Again, you should adopt baseline security measures like disable spontaneous pairing with any device can join your IT network. And for Trojan, it's harder to control that, but in principle, you should only install devices from manufacturers that you trust. And we know that this is difficult in practice. But okay, last scenario, and then I will conclude, is remote attacks. Remote attacks is when the attacker is on the internet. So the attacker might try to attack the gateway, but might also try to attack directly the IoT devices. So remote attacks are really, really critical because, for physical attacks and pairing attacks, you need to be close to the IoT network. But for remote attacks, you might be anyone on the internet, right? So the surface of the attack becomes really, really huge. So a network attack can intercept data, modify, forge commands. Just to give you if you want a trivial example, but is not so uncommon, if you have remote access through HTTP without the S, so HTTP is insecure, is in the clear, there's no cryptography, that protocol can be intercepted, fully intercepted, but it's also very easy to forge things like to inject commands, because there's no protection on confidentiality and integrity of what you transmit. But this is not the only problem. So one problem is the protocols. The other problem is the system attacks. If you have vulnerabilities, as we said before, we have this patching problem. So there are vulnerabilities on the IoT devices. There might be vulnerabilities on the gateways. This vulnerability might be exploited to get into the system, right? So for example, a non-bug on an unpatched device might allow an attacker to get into the gateway or get into the IoT network. Okay, so what are the possible solutions for remote attacks? First of all, very important, any device which faces, this is true in general, any device which is facing the internet should be protected with state-of-the-art solutions. And this is very important because the internet is really hostile and out of any control, right? The standard cryptographic solutions, examples are like TLS, which is the HTTPS that we use on the web, IPsec, that is used, for example, for VPNs, for virtual private networks. There are standard protocols that are typically supported by gateways and allows you to have security, from the gateway to the cloud and to mobile applications. One thing that it's important to mention, even if you don't need confidentiality, you just need authentication or integrity, well, it's not a good idea to send data in the clear on the internet. So this is why these protocols guarantees they enforce both confidentiality and integrity of transmission. Systems should be up to date. And we said this is problematic with IoT devices because in most of the cases, cannot be updated. And an interesting approach that it is worth mentioning is what is called application level gateways. An application level gateway is a gateway that gets your IoT commands. Think of a command to an IoT device, interpret the command, and sends after having interpreted the command, sends the command to the IoT devices. So in a sense, it's not that your communication goes through the gateway, which is what is done by default, but it's interpreted by the gateway, and then the gateway sends a set of controlled secure commands to the IoT devices. This stops most of the attacks from the internet because there's no direct connection, point-to-point connection to the device, but it's the gateway that sends the commands to the device. Okay, conclusion. let me try to summarize a few things. First of all, if you think of security, you have to accept to penalize usability in favor of security. You cannot think of having security without penalizing usability, because security and usability goes, they pull into different directions. Of course, security should be usable, but it's not so usable all the time. As I said many times, you should try to adopt baseline security solutions. So check what your technology supports and enable as many security features as possible, even if these penalize usability a bit. I suggest you to do that. You should also always try to protect your local IoT network, because the attacker might be physically close to it, especially because it's wireless connected. Do not expose directly your IoT devices to the internet. Try to go always through a gateway which is hardened and up to date. So keep your gateways up to date and hardened and secure, and always go through them to mediate, right, between the internet and devices. For IP protection, my suggestion is to try to use tamper-resistant chips. I know this is not widely accepted by industry, but maybe it will. It's something which is really, changing over the time, because the costs are reducing, and there's no final solution for that if you don't have a tamper-resistant chips. Otherwise, you can resort to obfuscation and other techniques. Okay, that's it. So this is my email and the URL of my security group, and I'm happy to discuss.
Thank you very much, Riccardo. We have not live people here, but we can just give a virtual for you very clear presentation that touch many points. We start immediately with some questions we received, because especially from Marc Fontanon, that's from professor from Cluster Lumiere, and I can read if you want the questions here. I read for all the people, but I think they received. So the first is a free question. I think the one is a comment. The first is when writing tenders for lighting installation, where could we find typical specification dealing with cybersecurity? I think it means in your experience, if is already some official integration in tender about cybersecurity problems. So if you want to give some comments on that, if you have any information on that. So, second question is...
okay, let's go to the questions. Then maybe I can...
Okay. Second question is about use of software and online platform that they use. Sometimes uses routines programs with Google, Firebase, and all that are accessible by Google. If it's safe, should we be more independent from Google? And the first question is about typical cyber attack in lighting, indoor and outdoor, is when an hacker shuts off the light installation. What is the best way to avoid this? But I think already a part of the answer is already in your presentation.
Okay,
but
yeah,
please.
So yeah, for the first one, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. I guess the question is. If there's any like standard
more not that standard, but if in experience, if in official tenders, for example, for big hospitals, buildings, is already some paragraph of the tenders related to some cyber security recommendation or requirements that your system had to, or now in this moment is just related to industrial thinking about to put the best way for cyber security.
Yeah.
Is there any specific prescription in official documents in your experience?
Well, from my let's say academic point of view, I know a little bit more about these like standards and the guidelines, general guidelines, more than like industrial specifications for that. I guess one thing that I probably didn't mention in the presentation is also certification. So sometimes you might want to certify your devices with respect to some again, some organization provide for that. like common criteria stuff and this kind of things. In that case, you have to, for a specific device or system, you have to do your like risk assessment and security analysis and provide the specifications of the properties that you want to achieve in your system and some form of proof that you took the right like baseline security or security mechanisms in place to achieve that. So I'm not sure if this answers the question, but yeah.
It is from a maybe industrial point of view. Right. So
yeah, it's more from the industrial
you don't know about official tenders, if you have special requirements.
Yeah, that's the point.
Okay. Second point is about Google.
Yeah, I mean that's a long debate. So I mean that's a long debate about the cloud. I would say. So anything that goes to these big companies, shall we trust them? Shall we be more independent from that? I guess it's really subjective. I mean, I can give my personal view, but which is I think that for individuals, you might have a point of view for individuals, but for companies it's different, right? Because for companies you might need to comply to regulations again. So my point of view for individuals is that I find it a bit strange that kind of people use like social networks and put all the pictures of themselves in any possible way on the web, and then they are complaining about Google tracking what they do. Okay. But that's just my personal.
So it's more privacy in the cybersecurity.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's privacy, and privacy. I would say it's outside the technical aspects. It's more about social aspects, and it's very subjective. So some people might, as I said, post pictures very freely, but then be very concerned about the fact that Google track their habits because they have some commercial advantages out of that. And I think this is what makes the difference. So yeah, it's hard to give the
solution. About third questions, that a typical cyber attack in lighting is when hacker shut off lighting.
Yeah, that's about availability. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the big problems. For lighting, you have that, but you can think of other, like automotive or other situations where you have safety issues, safety and economic issues. And that's about system availability. Yeah, the attacks that I discussed are all about that, because if you have a malicious device getting into your system, that device might behave maliciously and just shut down the system, like sending messages to make a denial of service attack. You might have that remotely. How to protect from that? You need to have security both sides. First of all, from the internet, protect access from the internet, because that's very dangerous. But also your local network should be protected in order to prevent someone to easily get into your IoT network.
Okay.
So you should use protocols.
Okay.
That,
okay. So we have another question. This was ready from Mark. That's about the collection of strategic data about the status of lighting sources. Is a comment. This should be reliable or so.
So strategic in a sense of the industry.
I think the question is about if cybersecurity is an issue, about the data you can collect about the status of the lamp, or it's maybe more privacy.
Well, I guess one thing could be an industrial advantage in, for example, discovering how much the quality of the lighting system from a different company. Yeah, that's could be a security thing. Yeah, that's a good point. I said that I don't see so much security in lighting, but that's a good example that I was wrong in a sense, because there are some information that might have an industrial interest.
Okay.
that I guess you might want to protect. So how much you replace the devices. Yeah, that's a good point. I guess that could be done at the edge layer, right? So the gateway, I mean, well, yeah, maybe you want to have that at the cloud level. So yeah, I think that's a good example of security.
Okay.
That I didn't think of.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe we have some request for clarification by François Brunet, Classe Lumière. What do you mean exactly by hardened gateway?
Right, that's a very good question. So hardened, in IT security, a hardened system is a system that has in place like special configurations and mechanisms to make it, in a sense, harder or stronger than the default system. So just to give an example, if you think of operating systems, any operating system, Linux, Windows, whatever, let's say the base system has a certain level of security, but you might add special mechanisms. An example is what is called mandatory access control. In Linux, there are a lot of them nowadays in standard distributions like AppArmor or SE Linux, stuff like that. So what they do is to profile the system in a way that applications only have access to the resources that they really need to use to have access to work, right? So you start an application, the system goes into a learning modality. You use the application and the system builds a configuration where that application will only have access to those resources. When you put the system to production, whatever extra access is like when you know, in a recent operating system that we use every day, you have this thing that when the application performs a new access, you get a pop-up and it asks you if you want to enable that specific thing. So that's comes from that word. In mandatory access control, you do that offline and then you put your system to production. And if you have an attack, the attack is kind of confined to a small subset of the resources. And this is not totally preventing problems, but is, you know, cutting, I mean, it's making exploitation of bugs much harder. So just to give a final example, in a basic system, you might have that an attacker finds a bug in the system, uses the bug and gets administration access to the system. In a hardened system, the bug might be there, but the attacker gets into the system and only get access to the specific process or user account and not to the administrator one, because there's an extra access control that prevents that guy to do previous escalation and to go all the way to the administration role. So it's, I don't know if this gives the idea.
Okay, in case we receive another question. Mark, thanks for your answer, and he has to leave. Okay. We have, I think he's going to write you directly
okay,
for
sure.
any other questions.
Yeah,
and I have another question that is more general about what are the most common cyber attacks to smart home, smart building devices. If you talk in general scenario, but if you have some real data about what is the most common devices and why the smart lighting system are becoming always more interesting for hackers, if you have any special ideas about the fact that the lighting is more interesting for hackers over, I don't know, appliances or over IoT devices in the home.
Yeah, so the first part is what are the most common attacks. I believe that the main issue is related to the fact that remote access is not, I mean, we live too much access from remote to the devices. So the fact that this isolation of the gateway, and that I think that is typical in like, I'd say not industrial, maybe in industrial installation, there's more security in the gateway, but in typical home installation from a typical person, you just plug the devices in your Wi-Fi and you get access to the internet, right? So you put a webcam and that goes to the internet. So there's no proper isolation of the device from the internet, because it's not obvious to do that. I mean, it's something that you need to develop in a proper way. So I think that the main issue. So there are engines where you can look for IoT devices and you find a lot of them, and you know that, and you can access directly to camera and whatever. So probably that's the main problem. And there has been attack of that kind even on industrial implants, right? So you Google for things, and maybe sometimes you have this tweet from people that say, oh, I got access to the control panel of an electric implant. So what should I do? I told them, but they don't stop it. So the fact that people tend to put things on the internet, that's the main problem of Industry 4.0, right? So we have this system that are industrial. So I'm switching to a slightly different setting, but we have industrial system that we put on the internet because we need to be connected, and there's no proper isolation of the system from the internet. It's a lot about usability. You want to plug and play something and to use it from your app, and this does not go very well with security. Right?
About lighting, do you have a special interest of hackers to introduce lighting over appliances?
So I think there might be two reasons for that. One is that lighting is a lot about it's very much cyber physical, right? So it's something that is really physical because it's about light, and probably it's kind of interesting by itself as a challenge. If you get access to something cyber physical, so you can modify lights. That's as a physical effect.
Like in the films where you set bulbs there with ghosts and everything in the house.
The other thing is that in lighting you have many devices, right? So you have your IoT networks have a lot of devices because you have a lot of small things. And as I said, this is appealing if you can get your hands on many things, and you might be able to launch a simple attack or to do something simple from many devices. They sum up and you have a huge effect. So maybe that could be another reason why. And the other thing is that devices become, they are simple, but in the years they become more and more powerful because the hardware is cheaper and cheaper. So you have something which is cheap but already has something which is already powerful enough to do something interesting. So
could be.
I guess this could be.
So next time we make some statistics in a few months.
I don't have
next
numbers.
Year, another meeting, and we check how many attacks to lighting system.
That could be interesting.
We check for statistics. I didn't receive any other question. I don't know if there's any question directly by the public. No, so I think we can close the meeting. We have just have some minutes more, but it's a very good, very interesting presentation. I think we send the slide of the presentation to the attenders about this presentation, and I think now we can close the first web.